July 2nd, 1943. The Mediterranean sun blazed over the rugged Sicilian landscape, turning the sky into a crucible of heat and light. At Castelvetrino Airfield, German and Italian fighters sat on the tarmac, ready to intercept the American bomber formations that had been pounding Axis positions relentlessly for weeks. The Luftwaffe pilots who climbed into their cockpits that morning were among the most experienced in the world. Veterans of campaigns across Europe, men who had faced British Spitfires over the Channel and Soviet Yaks over the Eastern Front. They were confident in their skill, their aircraft, and their superiority. They believed, as their ideology taught them, that they represented the pinnacle of military aviation, the product of a superior race engaged in a struggle for survival against inferior enemies. High above the Mediterranean, a formation of American P-40 Warhawks escorted B-25 Mitchell bombers toward their target. The P-40s were painted in standard U.S. Army Air Forces livery, and from a distance, they looked like any other American fighter squadron. But inside one of those cockpits sat First Lieutenant Charles B. Hall, a 22-year-old from Brazil, Indiana. And what was about to happen would shatter assumptions that both the German High Command and much of the American military establishment held as unquestionable truth. Hall's eyes tracked the sky, scanning constantly for threats. Fighter pilots lived or died by their vigilance, by their ability to spot enemy aircraft before being spotted themselves. And then he saw them too. Focke-Wulf 190s, sleek and deadly, diving toward the American bombers from above. The FW-190 was one of the finest fighters in the Luftwaffe's arsenal, faster and more heavily armed than Hall's aging P-40. But Hall didn't hesitate. He pushed his throttle forward, angled his fighter toward the diving Germans, and maneuvered into position. The German pilot, focused on the bombers, never saw the P-40 closing from his blind spot. Hall opened fire. Tracers streaked through the air, and machine gun rounds tore through the FW-190's fuselage. Smoke erupted from the German fighter. It rolled, tried to recover, then fell into an uncontrolled spiral toward the Sicilian countryside below. Charles Hall had just scored what German Luftwaffe commanders believed was impossible. A black American pilot had shot down one of their elite fighters. The swastika that would be painted on Hall's P-40 that afternoon represented the first confirmed aerial victory by an African-American pilot in United States military history. He would become the first of 112 enemy aircraft that would be destroyed in aerial combat. But the men the Germans would reportedly come to call Schwarzvogelmännchen, the Black Birdmen. And every single one of those victories was a bullet fired into the heart of an ideology that claimed such achievements were impossible. In Nazi Germany, racial doctrine was not merely propaganda or political rhetoric. It was enshrined in law and woven into every aspect of the state. The Nuremberg laws had classified black people as Untermenschen, subhuman, placed alongside Jews and Romani people in a hierarchy that positioned them as biologically inferior to the so-called Aryan race. Nazi pseudoscience claimed that people of African descent lacked the intelligence to master complex machinery, the courage for combat, the discipline for military service. They were useful only as laborers. The ideology insisted, incapable of the higher functions required for aerial combat. Yet here, above the Mediterranean skies, that ideology was about to collide catastrophically with reality. 992 trained pilots from Tuskegee, Alabama, men who had faced obstacles and prejudice that their white counterparts never encountered, would systematically demolish both German aircraft and German assumptions about racial superiority. This is a World War II history documentary about those men, about how they fought 3 wars simultaneously against the Luftwaffe in the skies over Europe, against Nazi racial ideology through their performance, and against American segregation through their undeniable excellence. This is the story of the Tuskegee Airmen, one of the great untold stories of World War II, a tale of courage, skill, and determination that changed the course of military history and helped reshape American society. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary chapter of Second World War history, if you're passionate about discovering these remarkable WW2 stories that often get overlooked in the standard histories, take just a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep explorations of military history. And I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment and let me know what city or country you're watching from. It's incredible to see how our community of history enthusiasts spans the entire globe. All of us connected by a fascination with understanding the real human stories behind the war documentary footage and history books. Now, let's step back to understand how we arrived at that moment over Sicily in July 1943. Because the path to Charles Hall's victory was long, brutal, and paved with the determination of people who refused to accept the limitations that society tried to impose on them. What the Luftwaffe pilots didn't know as they climbed into their cockpits to intercept American bomber formations in 1943, what even many American military commanders failed to understand, was that they were about to face some of the most rigorously trained, highly motivated fighter pilots in the entire United States Army Air Forces. These were men who had overcome obstacles that white pilots never faced, who had trained harder and longer than standard requirements demanded, and who carried into battle not just the weight of national duty that every soldier bore, but the additional burden of proving an entire race's capability. Every mission they flew, every German aircraft they engaged, every bomber they protected, all of it was scrutinized, judged, held up as evidence in an ongoing argument about human worth and potential. The mathematics of aerial combat would soon be written in the skies over Europe in numbers that could not be denied or dismissed. 15,000 combats or 1,578 missions, 112 aerial victories. A bomber escort loss rate significantly lower than that of white fighter groups. These statistics would eventually force even the most committed racist, even the most fanatical Nazi ideologue, to confront the bankruptcy of theories built on skin color rather than actual human capability.
But the journey toward that first aerial victory, toward Charles Hall's triumph over Sicily, began not in the clear skies of combat, but in the suffocating, hostile environment of American segregation. An environment that in some ways was as rigid and unforgiving as anything the Nazis had constructed in Germany. To understand the Tuskegee Airmen's achievement, you have to understand what they were fighting against at home, the system that told them from birth that they were inferior, incapable, unworthy of the opportunities that white Americans took for granted. In 1925, nearly 2 decades before Charles Hall would shoot down that Focke-Wulf 190, the United States Army War College published a document that would shape military policy for years to come. It was titled Employment of Negro Manpower in War, and it represented the official position of the American military establishment on the question of black soldiers. The report's conclusions were stark and unambiguous. Compared to the white man, he is admittedly of inferior mentality. He is inherently weak in character. This wasn't fringe racism or the opinion of a few prejudiced individuals. This was the official assessment of one of the most important institutions in the United States military, a document that carried the weight of authority and that would be cited in policy decisions for years. The report claimed that black soldiers lacked the intelligence necessary for technical roles, that they were unsuited for positions requiring complex decision-making, that they did not possess the courage or initiative required for combat leadership. The document recommended that black soldiers be used primarily in labor and supply roles, in positions where their supposed limitations would not endanger white soldiers or compromise military effectiveness. This was the intellectual and institutional framework within which American military aviation existed in the years leading up to World War II. Aviation, the most glamorous and technically demanding branch of military service, was considered far beyond the capabilities of black Americans. Yet even as military leaders clung to these prejudices with the tenacity of deeply held belief, even as they constructed policies designed to keep black Americans out of combat aviation, a small group of African Americans was already proving every assumption wrong. The evidence was there for anyone willing to see it. Scattered across the world in the stories of individuals who had found ways around American racism to demonstrate their capabilities. Eugene Jacques Bullard was perhaps the most striking example, a man whose story should have forced a reassessment of every assumption about race in aviation. Born in Georgia in 1895, Bullard had fled American racism as a teenager, making his way to Europe, where he eventually settled in France. When World War I erupted, he joined the French Foreign Legion, fighting in the trenches, earning the Croix de Guerre for valor. Then he transferred to the French Air Service, becoming one of the few black combat pilots in the world. He flew missions over the Western Front, engaged German aircraft, survived being wounded. By all accounts, he was a skilled and courageous pilot. But when the United States entered World War I and began forming its own air service, Bullard tried to transfer to the American forces. He was rejected. The U.S. military would not accept a black pilot, even one with proven combat experience, even one who had already demonstrated exactly the qualities they claimed black men lacked. Bessie Coleman's story was similarly revealing. Born in Texas in 1892, she developed a passion for aviation in the years after World War I when barnstorming pilots and air shows captured the American imagination. She applied to flight schools across America and was rejected by every single one because of her race and gender. So she did what Eugene Bullard had done. She went to France. She learned French, traveled to Paris, enrolled in the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, and in 1921 became the first African-American woman and the first Native American woman to earn a pilot's license. She returned to America and became a celebrated barnstormer and exhibition pilot, performing daring aerial maneuvers and advocating for the establishment of flight schools that would accept black students. By the 1930s, a small but growing community of black civilian pilots existed in America, trained at a handful of schools willing to defy social convention. The Coffey School of Aeronautics in Chicago, run by Cornelius Coffey and Willa Brown, had trained dozens of black pilots, demonstrating conclusively that flying skill knew no racial boundaries. These pilots proved that the Army War College's assessment was not just wrong but absurdly, demonstrably false. Yet the evidence was ignored. The military establishment simply refused to reconsider its position. The pressure for change came not from within the military but from the outside, from civil rights organizations and black newspapers and political leaders who understood that World War II represented both a crisis and an opportunity. As war clouds gathered over Europe in the late 1930s, as Hitler's Germany rearmed and expanded, as the possibility of American involvement grew more likely, black leaders began to push harder for inclusion in all aspects of military service, including aviation. Walter White, the executive secretary of the NAACP, used every tool at his disposal to lobby the Roosevelt administration. A. Philip Randolph, the powerful labor leader who had organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, threatened massive demonstrations in Washington if the government didn't address discrimination in defense industries and the military. Judge William H. Hastie, who would later become the first black federal judge, used his legal expertise to challenge discriminatory policies. Black newspapers, the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Baltimore Afro-American, hammered away at the contradiction at the heart of American policy with a simple, devastating question. How could America claim to fight for democracy and freedom abroad while denying those same principles to millions of its own citizens at home? This was the Double V campaign that would later crystallize during the war victory against fascism abroad, victory against racism at home. And nowhere was the contradiction more stark than in the military, where black Americans were expected to risk their lives for a country that treated them as second-class citizens, that denied them opportunities, that segregated them even as they served. The political pressure began to produce results, though slowly and grudgingly. On April 3, 1939, Public Law 18 was passed, a piece of legislation that would crack open a door that the military establishment had kept firmly closed. Senator Harry H. Schwartz had inserted an amendment requiring the civilian pilot training program, which was being expanded as part of pre-war military preparation, to include one or more schools designated by the Civil Aeronautics Authority for the training of any Negro air pilot. It was a grudging concession wrapped in the language of segregation, separate schools, separate programs, but it was a beginning. It established the principle that black Americans had a right to aviation training, even if that training would be segregated. By 1940, as Franklin Roosevelt ran for an unprecedented third term, the political calculus had shifted enough to force further concessions. Roosevelt needed black votes in key northern cities like Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and New York. The black electorate had been growing more politically active, more organized, more willing to make demands and to punish politicians who ignored them. Civil rights leaders made clear that their support in the election was conditional on meaningful progress toward equality in defense industries and military service. On January 16, 1941, merely a year before Pearl Harbor would bring America fully into World War II, Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson announced the formation of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, an all-black flying unit that would be trained in the United States and potentially deployed in combat. The announcement was carefully worded, hedged with caveats that revealed the military's continued skepticism. This would be an experiment, Stimson emphasized, designed to test whether blacks could actually be trained as combat pilots. The assumption embedded in that language was clear success was uncertain, perhaps even unlikely, and if the experiment failed, it would justify continuing the policy of exclusion. The decision to create this unit was not primarily a recognition of justice or equality. It was a political calculation, a minimum concession designed to ease pressure from civil rights groups while maintaining the fundamental structure of segregation. The military establishment, from the top leadership down through the ranks, remained deeply skeptical that black pilots would succeed. Many officers hoped, perhaps even expected, that the experiment would fail, that it would provide definitive proof that the old policies had been correct all along. But what the skeptics didn't understand, what they couldn't see through their prejudice, was that the men who would volunteer for this program were not looking for a favor or seeking special treatment. They were determined to prove themselves, to shatter every stereotype, to demonstrate through undeniable performance that the color of a pilot's skin had nothing whatsoever to do with his ability to fly and fight. And they would succeed beyond anything the military establishment had imagined possible, rewriting the rules and changing history in the process. The location chosen for this unprecedented experiment was Tuskegee, Alabama, a decision laden with irony and strategic calculation. Tuskegee was deep in the segregated South, in a state where Jim Crow laws governed every aspect of public life, where black Americans faced daily humiliation and violence, where the Ku Klux Klan operated with virtual impunity. It was not chosen because it was welcoming or progressive. It was chosen precisely because it was isolated, because the training could be conducted away from public scrutiny, and because Tuskegee Institute, a historically black college founded by Booker T. Washington, provided existing infrastructure and a connection to the black community. Tuskegee Institute had been training black pilots through the civilian pilot training program since 1939, under the direction of Chief Alfred Anderson, a black aviator with thousands of flight hours who had proven his capabilities long before the military took notice. The Army Air Corps would build on this foundation, constructing a new airfield, Tuskegee Army Air Field, which would become the training ground for what the military still referred to as an experiment. The men who arrived at Tuskegee to begin flight training in 1941 and 1942 came from across America, from cities and small towns, from different economic backgrounds and educational levels. But they shared certain characteristics. They were volunteers, men who had actively sought out this opportunity despite knowing the obstacles they would face. Many of them were college-educated at a time when only a small percentage of any Americans, black or white, attended university. They were ambitious, determined, willing to work harder than their white counterparts because they understood that anything less than excellence would be used as evidence of inferiority.
The training program at Tuskegee was deliberately more rigorous than standard pilot training. Cadets flew more hours, 300, compared to 204 white pilot candidates. The academic requirements were stringent, covering navigation, meteorology, aircraft mechanics, aerial tactics, gunnery. The physical requirements were demanding, and the washout rate was extraordinary. Approximately 60% of candidates failed to complete the program, compared to roughly 40% for white aviation cadets. Only the very best survived, creating what Colonel Noel Parrish, the white commander of Tuskegee Army Air Field, who believed in the program and fought for its success, called a super-selected group. This rigorous selection meant that the pilots who eventually graduated and deployed to combat were, on average, more thoroughly trained and more highly motivated than typical fighter pilots. But it also meant they carried enormous pressure. Every flight, every maneuver, every test was scrutinized. Failure was not just personal, it was racial, used as ammunition by those who wanted the experiment to fail. Success had to be undeniable, overwhelming, impossible to dismiss. Among the first class of cadets was Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., a man who embodied both the promise and the pain of black military service in America. Davis was the son of Benjamin O. Davis, Sr., who in 1940 had become the first black general in the United States Army. The younger Davis had graduated from West Point in 1936, but his 4 years at the military academy had been a special kind of hell. The white cadets had subjected him to silencing, a cruel tradition where they refused to speak to him outside of official duties. For 4 years, he had eaten alone, studied alone, walked through campus in a bubble of enforced isolation. No one had been his friend. No one had been his roommate. He had endured this psychological torture with remarkable discipline, graduating 35th in a class of 276, proving his competence through sheer force of will. Now, in 1942, as he prepared to lead the 99th Pursuit Squadron, soon to be renamed the 99th Fighter Squadron, Davis understood what was at stake. He was not just commanding a military unit. He was leading a proof of concept. If the 99th succeeded, it would open doors. If it failed, those doors would slam shut. Perhaps for generations. The weight of 13 million black Americans, the hopes and aspirations of an entire segment of the population, rested on his shoulders and the shoulders of the men he would lead into combat. The 99th Fighter Squadron departed for North Africa in April 1943, part of the massive Allied buildup following Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa that had begun in November 1942. By the spring of 1943, American and British forces had pushed the Germans and Italians into Tunisia, and the final campaign to clear Axis forces from Africa was underway. The 99th would join this campaign, but they would do so under circumstances designed to maximize scrutiny and minimize their chances of success. They were attached to the 33rd Fighter Group under the command of Colonel William W. Mamier, a white officer who made no secret of his skepticism about black pilots' capabilities. Some accounts suggest Mamier actively hoped they would fail, that he wanted to prove the experiment was misguided. Whether this was active malice or simply the prejudice of the era, the effect was the same. The 99th was assigned patrol missions over the Mediterranean, relatively safe assignments that kept them away from the most intense combat. They were given worn, hand-me-down P-40 Warhawks, aircraft that were already obsolete by 1943 standards, inferior to the German Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s they would eventually face. The P-40 Warhawk was a pre-war design, a liquid-cooled, single-engine fighter that had been effective in the early years of the war, but was now outclassed by newer German and Japanese aircraft. It was slower than the Bf-109, less maneuverable than the FW-190, and its ceiling was lower than both. But it was rugged. It could take punishment, and in the hands of a skilled pilot who understood its limitations and exploited its strengths, particularly its superior turning ability at low altitude, it could still be effective. The pilots of the 99th would have to be better than their opponents to overcome their equipment. Disadvantage: the morning of June 2nd, 1943, marked the 99th Fighter Squadron's first combat mission. They were tasked with escorting bombers attacking the Italian-held island of Punt, a heavily fortified position between Tunisia and Sicily that the Allies needed to neutralize before invading Sicily itself. As the formation of worn P-40s climbed toward their target, German fighters suddenly appeared, Bf-109s from a nearby airfield, experienced pilots who had been fighting in the Mediterranean theater for months or years. What happened next was critical. The pilots of the 99th held their formation. They didn't break, didn't panic, didn't scatter. They maintained discipline, stayed with their bombers, engaged the German fighters when necessary, but never abandoned their primary mission. No American aircraft were lost. No German aircraft were shot down. By the strict metrics of aerial combat, it was a draw. But in the larger context, it was a victory. The black pilots had faced combat, had been tested under fire, and had performed their mission successfully. The Germans had learned their first lesson about these new American pilots. They wouldn't break under pressure, but it was July 2nd, 1943, exactly 1 month later, that everything changed. That the Tuskegee Airmen announced their arrival in a way that could not be ignored or dismissed. Charles Hall was flying his 8th combat mission that day, part of an escort for B-25 Mitchell bombers attacking Castelvetrano Air Field in Sicily. The Allied invasion of Sicily was just days away, and the air forces were pounding Axis positions relentlessly, trying to establish air superiority before the amphibious landings. Hall later described what happened with the precision of a trained military officer filing a combat report. I saw 2 Flak-Soufs following the bombers just after the bombs were dropped. I headed for the space between the fighters and bombers and managed to turn inside the Jerry's turning radius. I fired a long burst and saw my tracers penetrate the second aircraft. He was turning to the left but suddenly fell off and headed straight into the ground. When Hall landed back at base, his aircraft's armorer painted a small swastika on the fuselage, the traditional marking of an aerial victory. And the entire base erupted. Black ground crews who had endured months of insults and condescension from white personnel, who had been subjected to the casual racism that permeated military life, suddenly had an answer to every slight every suggestion of inferiority. One of their pilots had shot down a German fighter. It was the first aerial victory by a black American pilot in United States military history. A moment that proved beyond any doubt that black pilots could fight and win in aerial combat. News of the victory spread through the black press in America, though it received minimal coverage in white newspapers. The Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, the Baltimore Afro-American ran banner headlines celebrating Hall's achievement in black communities across America. Families followed the 99th's progress with intense interest, seeing in these pilots a validation of their own worth, a refutation of the constant message of inferiority that segregation communicated every day. But if Charles Hall's victory in July was a breakthrough moment, the months that followed were frustrating. The 99th continued to fly missions, continued to perform competently, but they were not given opportunities to distinguish themselves. Colonel Mamier's assessment of their performance was harsh. By January 1944, after 7 months of combat operations, he filed a report that threatened to destroy everything the Tuskegee Airmen had been working toward. The report claimed the 99th lacked aggressiveness, that they were not performing as well as white fighter squadrons, and he recommended they be removed from combat operations and reassigned to coastal patrol or other non-combat duties. The report made its way up the chain of command to General Henry Hop Arnold, the commanding general of the Army Air Forces and one of the most powerful military officers in America. Arnold, who had never been enthusiastic about the integration experiment, prepared to shut it down. If a combat commander was reporting that black pilots couldn't handle frontline duty, that seemed to confirm the old prejudices. The experiment had been tried, it had failed, and the military could return to its traditional policies with a clear conscience. But then came Anzio, and everything changed again. On January 22, 1944, Allied forces launched Operation Shingle, an ambitious amphibious landing at Anzio, Sud of Rome, designed to outflank German defensive positions and potentially capture Rome itself. The operation quickly bogged down. German forces, commanded by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, reacted with surprising speed, containing the Allied beachhead and launching fierce counter. The Allies found themselves trapped on a narrow strip of beach, under constant artillery bombardment and air attack. On January 27th and 28th, 1944, the Luftwaffe launched massive raids on the Allied forces pinned down at Anzio, trying to destroy the beachhead before it could be reinforced. 15 pilots of the 99th Fighter Squadron, still flying their obsolete P-40 Warhawks, were vectored to defend the beachhead. They encountered formations of Focke-Wulf 190 Segundos, some of the Luftwaffe's best fighters flown by experienced pilots, aircraft that were superior to the P-40s. In almost every performance category, what followed would silence the critics forever and rewrite the narrative about black pilots' capabilities. Over those 2 days of intense aerial combat, the 99th shot down multiple enemy aircraft. Historical sources vary on the exact number. Some accounts say 8. Others claim as many as 13 confirmed kills over the 2-day period. The fog of war, the chaos of aerial combat, the difficulties in confirming victories all contribute to these discrepancies. But what is undeniable is that the 99th, flying inferior equipment, achieved a dramatic success against a numerically superior enemy flying better aircraft. Captain Charles Hall, who had scored that first historic victory over Sicily 7 months earlier, claimed 2 more victories at Anzio, bringing his personal total to 3 confirmed kills. Other pilots, Lieutenant Clarence Lackey Lester, Lieutenant Howard Bohr, Lieutenant Wilson Eagle Sinall, scored victories. In 2 days of combat, flying aircraft that were already obsolete when they arrived in North Africa. The pilots of the 99th had destroyed more enemy aircraft than they had in their previous 7 months of combat operations combined. The War Department, confronted with this undeniable success, launched a formal study comparing the 99th Fighter Squadron's performance with other P-40 squadrons in the Mediterranean theater. The study's conclusions were clear and unequivocal. The 99th was performing at the same level as comparable white units, and in some metrics, such as bomber protection and mission discipline, they were performing better. Colonel Mamier's assessment had been wrong, influenced more by prejudice than by objective analysis. The recommendation to remove the 99th from combat was quietly shelved, never to be raised again. The success at Anzio had enormous implications that rippled through the entire American military aviation establishment. It proved that black pilots could not only fight competently, but could excel in the most demanding circumstances. It demonstrated that the differences in performance that Mamir had noted, if they existed at all, had nothing to do with race and everything to do with equipment, experience, and mission assignments. And it opened the door for expansion of the program, for the creation of additional black fighter squadrons that would soon make an even greater impact on the war. In May 1944, a momentous change occurred that would transform the Tuskegee Airmen from a single experimental squadron into a full-fledged fighter group, with the potential to influence the course of the strategic bombing campaign over Europe. The 332nd Fighter Group was activated, combining 4 fighter squadrons, the 99th, which had proven itself in North Africa and Italy, along with the 100th, 301 SFT, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons, all trained at Tuskegee and freshly arrived in the Mediterranean theater. The 332nd was assigned to the 15th Air Force, based in Italy, and given a mission that would define their legacy: long-range bomber escort, flying the dangerous missions deep into Nazi-controlled Europe to protect American heavy bombers, attacking German industry, oil refineries, and transportation networks. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who had commanded the 99th through its trials in North Africa, took command of the 332nd Fighter Group. He gathered his pilots at Ramitelli Airfield on Italy's Adriatic coast, a primitive base compared to other American installations, and delivered a message that would become the philosophical foundation of the Red Tails, as they would soon be known. "We cannot afford to lose bombers," he told them. "Our job is not to be aces. Our job is not to rack up personal victory scores. Our job is to bring those bombers home. We stay with the bombers, no matter what." This directive, this philosophy of mission discipline over personal glory, would define the 332nd's approach to combat and would earn them the fierce loyalty of the bomber crews they protected, in a fighter pilot culture that often celebrated individual achievement. That kept score of aerial victories and turned successful pilots into celebrities. Davis was asking his men to subordinate their personal ambitions to the larger mission. Stay with the bombers. Don't chase off after easy kills, except that German fighters might escape rather than abandon your assigned formation. It was a difficult discipline, one that went against every fighter pilot's instinct, but it would prove devastatingly effective. In June 1944, General Nathan Twining, commanding general of the 15th Air Force, ordered a systematic marking system for all fighter groups under his command. Each group would receive distinctive colors for instant identification, both to help bomber crews recognize their escorts and to help group commanders assess their units' performance in the swirling chaos of aerial combat. The 332nd Fighter Group was assigned the color red, not just red noses or red bands, but entire tail sections painted bright crimson. Later, red propeller spinners and red nosebands would be added, creating one of the most distinctive and recognizable paint schemes of World War II. The P-51 Mustangs that the 332nd began receiving in July 1944 were a quantum leap forward from the worn P-40s they had been flying. The North American P-51D Mustang was perhaps the finest fighter aircraft of the Second World War, a masterpiece of American engineering that combines speed, range, firepower, and handling in a single elegant package. Its Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine gave it a top speed of 437 miles per hour. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns could shred any aircraft. And most importantly for the bomber escort mission, its range over 1,600 miles, with external drop tanks allowed it to escort bombers anywhere in Nazi-controlled Europe and still have fuel to fight. The red-tailed Mustangs became instantly recognizable, and bomber crews began to spread word through the informal networks that connected units. Request the red tails if you can get them. The first bomber crews to receive red tail escorts often didn't know their protectors were black pilots. They only knew that these fighters stayed close, maintained formation discipline, never abandoned them to chase after distant targets. The red tails were different from other escort groups, which sometimes prioritized shooting down German fighters over protecting their assigned bombers. The 332nd's philosophy was clear. Bomber protection first, aerial victories second. July 18th, 1944, brought a test that would challenge everything the Red Tails had built. A mission that would push them to their limits and provide ammunition for both their supporters and their critics. Colonel Davis led 66 B-51 Mustangs to rendezvous with a bomber formation targeting the Luftwaffe base at Memmingen, deep in southern Germany. The bombers were late, significantly delayed by weather or navigation issues. Davis faced a critical decision. He could return to base, as standing orders technically allowed if a rendezvous failed, or he could remain in enemy airspace, burning precious fuel while orbiting in hostile territory, hoping the bombers would arrive before the Mustangs ran low on gas. Davis chose to wait. It was a decision that demonstrated both his commitment to the mission and his willingness to accept risk to protect the bombers. When the B-17 flying fortresses finally appeared, so did the Luftwaffe, approximately 100 German fighters. Attacking from multiple directions in a coordinated assault, the Germans had learned through bitter experience that overwhelming numbers, attacking simultaneously from different angles, might break even the most disciplined defensive screen. The aerial combat that followed was savage. 20 minutes of desperate fighting at high altitude over German territory. The Red Tails claimed 11 to 12 confirmed victories, but despite their fierce defense, 15 B-17s fell to German fighters. 3 pilots from the 332nd were killed, Second Lieutenants Robert Hutton, Wellington Irving, and Alfred Brown. Their names added to the growing list of Tuskegee Airmen who had paid the ultimate price. Critics of the program, still looking for evidence to support their prejudices, seized on the bomber losses. 15 heavy bombers destroyed was a significant loss, and some officers argued it proved black pilots couldn't handle major battles, couldn't maintain discipline under overwhelming pressure. But operational analyses revealed a more nuanced truth. The 332nd had arrived at an impossible situation. The bombers were already under attack when the Mustangs made contact. The German fighters were present in overwhelming numbers, and the Red Tails had nevertheless prevented what could have been a catastrophic massacre. Without the 332nd's intervention, losses might have been 30 or 40 bombers instead of 15. And crucially, after the initial attack, the Red Tails had maintained their defensive screen, preventing further losses as the surviving bombers withdrew. The mission to Memmingen was both a demonstration of the Red Tails' skill and courage and a reminder of the impossible standards they were being held to. A loss rate of 15 bombers out of a large formation was tragic, but not unusual for a heavily defended target deep in Germany. White fighter groups had experienced similar or worse bomber losses on major missions without having their overall competence questioned. But for the 332nd, every mission was scrutinized, every loss examined for evidence of failure. They could not afford to be merely competent. They had to be exceptional, consistently, overwhelmingly, in order to silence critics who were actively looking for reasons to end the integration experiment. By March 1945, the European war was entering its final phase. The Luftwaffe's conventional fighter force had been ground down by 2 years of relentless attrition, unable to replace losses in aircraft or experienced pilots. But Germany had one final technological card to play, one last hope for challenging Allied air supremacy. The Messerschmitt Me 262 Schwalbe, the world's first operational jet fighter, and a revolutionary aircraft that represented a leap forward in aviation technology. The Me 262 was extraordinary, powered by 2 Junkers Jumo turbojet engines that gave it a top speed of approximately 540 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the fastest Allied propeller-driven fighters. It was armed with 4 30mm cannons that could tear apart a B-17 with a short burst. In the hands of an experienced pilot, it could make slashing attacks on bomber formations, diving through the protective screen of fighters before they could react, destroying bombers and escaping before escort fighters could catch up. If Germany had developed the Me-262 earlier and produced it in large numbers, it might have significantly extended the war. But by 1945, it was too late. There were too few jets, too little fuel, and not enough trained pilots. On March 24, 1945, the 332nd Fighter Group received one of its most challenging assignments of the entire war: escort bombers on a 1,600-mile round trip to Berlin to attack the Daimler-Benz tank factory. Intelligence reports warned that Me-262s from Jagdjet, one of the Luftwaffe's elite jet fighter units, would defend the target. Colonel Davis led 43 P-51 Mustangs into the heart of the Reich, knowing they would face the most advanced fighters in the world. As the formation approached Berlin, the Me-262s appeared the largest concentration of jet fighters assembled for a single interception up to that point in the war. For the German pilots, it was a desperate attempt to inflict maximum damage on the American bombers, to prove that German technology could still challenge Allied air power. For the Red Tails, it was the ultimate test of skill, discipline, and courage. Second Lieutenant Roscoe Brown had studied the Me-262's characteristics, had attended briefings on its capabilities and weaknesses. Jets were faster in level flight and in dives, but they had limitations. Their early turbojet engines were temperamental, prone to flame out if the throttle was moved too quickly. They had poor acceleration at low speeds, and critically, they had blind spots, just like any aircraft. We knew the German jets were faster than we were, Braun later explained in an interview. Instead of going directly after them, we went away from them and then turned into their blind spots. Brown shot down one Me-262, a feat that only a handful of Allied pilots would achieve during the entire war. His combat report, filed immediately after landing, described the engagement with clinical precision. I pulled up at him in a 15-degree climb and fired 3 long bursts at 2,000 feet at 8 o'clock to him. Almost immediately, the pilot bailed out from about 24,500 feet. The jet, one of Germany's most advanced weapons, tumbled toward the ground, while its pilot descended by parachute, saved by his decision to abandon the aircraft rather than ride it down. Second Lieutenant Earl Lane accomplished what many aviation experts considered nearly impossible, shooting down a Me-262 with a deflection shot from 2,000 yards, using the new K-14 computing gun sight. The K-14 was an advanced gyroscopic sight that helped pilots calculate the correct lead angle for hitting a moving target, but it still required extraordinary skill and judgment to use effectively, especially against a target moving at jet speeds. Second Lieutenant Charles Brantley claimed the third jet victory that day, giving the 332nd an unprecedented achievement. The destruction of 3 Me-262s in a single engagement represented more German jets than most fighter groups would destroy in months of combat. The Red Tails had just exceeded the cumulative total of all previous American Me-262 kills in one afternoon of combat over Berlin. The 332nd Fighter Group earned a Distinguished Unit Citation for the March 24th mission, a rare honor that recognized exceptional performance under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. It was official recognition at the highest levels of command that these pilots had achieved something remarkable. But for many of the Tuskegee Airmen, the real validation came not from medals or citations, but from the letters they received from bomber crews, from the men whose lives they had saved. Not all encounters between Tuskegee Airmen and Germans ended in victory. 32 pilots became prisoners of war during the course of their combat operations, and their experiences behind barbed wire revealed complex and sometimes surprising interactions between Nazi ideology and military reality, exposing contradictions in how the Third Reich treated different categories of prisoners. Second Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson was shot down on August 12, 1944, during his 19th mission. His P-51 took anti-aircraft fire over southern France while attacking radar installations, part of the effort to blind German defenses before the upcoming Allied invasion of southern France. His engine failed. The Mustang became uncontrollable, and Jefferson bailed out, parachuting into enemy territory where he was quickly captured by German forces. At his interrogation center, Jefferson encountered something that shook him. The German intelligence officer questioning him knew an extraordinary amount about the 332nd Fighter Group, about the Tuskegee Airmen specifically. Information that went far beyond what Jefferson would have expected. The interrogator had detailed information about Ramitelli Air Field. Jefferson recalled in his post-war memoir, he knew about our squadron commanders, their names and backgrounds. He even had details about my parents' home in Detroit. He knew my father was a teacher, knew my mother's maiden name. Their intelligence on us was frighteningly thorough. This level of German intelligence gathering was not unique to the Tuskegee Airmen. The Luftwaffe's interrogation services were remarkably sophisticated, compiling detailed information on Allied units through a combination of signals, intelligence, prisoner interrogation, and agents in neutral countries. But Jefferson was struck by the thoroughness with which the Germans had researched the black pilots specifically, suggesting they viewed the 332nd as a unit worthy of particular attention and study. Inside Stalag Luft Tercero, the prisoner of war camp for Allied Air Force officers made famous by the Great Escape. Jefferson found himself in a complex environment where the rigid racial theories of Nazi ideology seemed to bend under the practical realities of military convention. He was treated, by and large, like any other American officer. White prisoners of war from bomber crews, men who had been protected by red-tail escorts, often approached Jefferson and other black posts with gratitude and respect. These interactions, which would have been difficult or impossible in segregated America, occurred naturally in a German prison camp. Here I was in a Nazi prison camp, Jefferson later reflected, being treated more equally by white Americans than I would be back home. German guards enforced the Geneva Convention fairly. White American officers shared Red Cross packages with black officers, ate with us, talked with us as equals. It was surreal. We were fighting against Nazi racism, yet experiencing less discrimination as prisoners in Germany than we faced as free men in Alabama or Mississippi. This wasn't universal. Some prisoners remained segregated by a choice or by the internal politics of the camp, and there were certainly incidents of racism even behind barbed wire. But the general pattern was clear in the artificial environment of the POW camp. Removed from American social structures, racial barriers that seemed immutable at home proved surprisingly fragile. When the war ended, and Jefferson returned to the United States in the summer of 1945, he was immediately resegregated at the disembarkation point. Black servicemen were directed to separate facilities, separate transportation, separate everything. The country they had fought for, the democracy they had defended, welcomed them home by reminding them of their second-class status. It was a bitter homecoming, one that would fuel the growing civil rights movement in the years to come. While accounts suggest that German pilots reportedly acknowledged the red-tail skill with the nickname Squirtse Bohelmensjan, their most vocal champions were American bomber crews, the men who owed their lives to red-tail protection. These men, who faced death on every mission over Germany, cared nothing about race or ideology. They cared about survival, and they knew the red tails gave them the best chance of coming home alive. Bomber crews developed their own mythology about the red tails, stories that spread through informal networks and became part of bomber culture. They talked about the red tails' distinctive flying style, the way they waggled their wings in greeting when joining a formation, their tight, disciplined formations that never wavered under pressure, their absolute refusal to abandon damaged bombers that were limping home. Red Tail Angels became the bomber crew's nickname for them, a term that captured both gratitude and respect. The statistics supported the bomber crew's preferences and validated their mythology. Research conducted after the war by Air Force historians, particularly the meticulous work of Dr. Daniel Holman at the Air Force Historical Research Agency, revealed that bombers under 332nd Fighter Group Escort lost an average of 27 aircraft to enemy fighters over the course of the war, compared to an average of 46 losses for other P-51 fighter groups. In the 15th Air Force flying similar missions, this superior protection rate occurred, despite the Red Tails flying some of the longest and most dangerous missions of the war, escorting bombers 2 targets deep in Germany, Austria, and occupied Eastern Europe. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Tuskegee Airmen had compiled a combat record that demolished every pre-war assumption about black military capability, that made a mockery of the Army War College's 1925 assessment, that proved beyond any possibility of denial that excellence in aerial combat had nothing whatsoever to do with skin color. The numbers were comprehensive and undeniable. Combat operations: 1,578 combat missions flown, over 15,000 individual combat sorties completed, 179 bomber escort missions, 2 targets across occupied Europe and Germany, 311 missions flown for the 15th Air Force. Enemy aircraft destroyed: 112. Enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, a figure that made the 332nd one of the most successful fighter groups in the Mediterranean theater. An additional 150 enemy aircraft destroyed on the ground during strafing missions. 3 Mi-262 jet fighters shot down on March 24, 1945. An achievement that highlighted the technical skill and tactical acumen of these pilots. Ground targets destroyed: 950 rail cars, trucks, and military vehicles. Critical assets that supported German logistics: 254 locomotive engines. Strikes that paralyzed German transportation networks. The former Italian destroyer Giuseppe, damaged beyond repair on June 25, 1944, demonstrating that the Red Tails could attack naval targets as effectively as they protected bombers. Individual achievements told stories of personal excellence within the larger narrative. First, Lieutenant Lee Archer achieved 4 confirmed victories, making him one of the leading aces among the Tuskegee Airmen. Captain Joseph Ellsbury claimed 4 victories, including 3 Focke-Wulf 190s, destroyed on July 12, 1944, in a single mission. First, Lieutenant Edward Toppins earned 4 confirmed kills. Second, Lieutenant Clarence Lucky Lester shot down 3 German fighters in one mission on July 18th. 1944, during that fierce battle over Mimi, the decorations earned by the Tuskegee Airmen reflected official recognition of their achievements. 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses awarded 2 332nd Fighter Group pilots, one of the highest honors for aerial combat, 744 air medals for meritorious achievement, 14 Bronze Stars. 8 Purple Hearts 4 pilots wounded in combat, 3 Distinguished Unit Citations for the 99th Fighter Squadron, recognizing exceptional performance, 1 Distinguished Unit Citation for the entire 332nd Fighter Group for the Berlin mission in March 1945. But behind these statistics, these medals and citations and confirmed victories, lay a human cost that could not be minimized or forgotten. 66 pilots were killed in action. Their lives ended in the skies over Europe or in crashes on unfamiliar terrain. 32 pilots became prisoners of war, enduring months of captivity. Another 84 men, pilots and crew members, were killed in training accidents and non-combat missions, a reminder that flying in the 1940s was inherently dangerous, even without enemy action. Each of these numbers represented a person, a family that received a telegram, a community that mourned. The cost of proving equality, of demonstrating capability, of challenging an unjust system, was paid in blood and grief. But those who paid that price did so willingly, understanding that they were fighting for something larger than themselves, for a principle that would outlast any individual life. The transformation from mockery to respect, from doubt to admiration, wasn't just about courage, though the Tuskegee Airmen demonstrated courage in abundance. It reflected superior training methods, technological advantages that they wielded with precision and skill, and an organizational culture that emphasized discipline and mission focus over individual glory. At Tuskegee, pilots flew significantly more hours than their white counterparts. 300 training hours compared to 204 white pilots, a 50% increase that gave them additional experience and proficiency before entering combat. They practiced formation flying obsessively, knowing that in combat, discipline and coordination would be their edge against more experienced Luftwaffe pilots. The washout rate at Tuskegee was 60%, compared to 40% for white cadet programs, creating what Colonel Noel Parrish called a super-selected group of pilots who had survived the most rigorous screening process in American military aviation. The progression through aircraft types told its own story of evolution and improvement. The 99th Fighter Squadron began with hand-me-down P-40 Warhawks, aircraft that were already obsolete when they arrived in North Africa, outclassed by German Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s in almost every performance metric. These liquid-cooled Alice-NG fighters were slower, had a lower service ceiling, and lacked the climb rate of their German opponents. Yet Tuskegee pilots used the P-40's superior turning ability and rugged construction to hold their own, compensating for technical disadvantages through skill and tactics. The arrival of P-51 Mustangs in July 1944 transformed the Red Tails into equals of any fighter unit in the war. The North American P-51D Mustang represented American industrial and engineering perfection, a synthesis of aerodynamic design and powerful propulsion. Its packet-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine produced over 1,400 horsepower, giving the Mustang a top speed of 437 miles per hour, an excellent performance at all altitudes. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute, could destroy any aircraft. Most importantly for the bomber escort mission, its range over 1,600 miles with external drop tanks allowed it to escort bombers to any target in the Reich, and still have fuel reserves for combat and the return journey. Behind every pilot who shot down a German aircraft, behind every successful mission, stood dozens of support personnel who made victory possible. Mechanics who kept engines running in primitive conditions. Armorers who loaded ammunition and maintained guns. Crew chiefs who supervised maintenance and ensured aircraft were combat ready. Of the approximately 16,000 men and women associated with the Tuskegee Airmen program over the course of the war, fewer than 1,000 were pilots. The rest were the unsung heroes whose technical expertise and dedication kept the red tails flying. The ground crews at Ramitelli Airfield in Italy worked miracles with limited resources. The base was primitive compared to other American installations, lacking many amenities and facilities that other units took for granted. Spare parts were chronically scarce, with the 332nd often last in line for supplies in a military that still practiced segregation in its logistics chain. Yet the aircraft availability rate, the percentage of planes ready for combat on any given day, equaled or exceeded that of white units, a testament to the ingenuity and dedication of these ground crews. These support personnel also faced combat dangers. German air raids on Ramitelli were rare, but deadly when they occurred. On March 24, 1944, a German bombing raid struck the airfield, killing several support personnel and destroying equipment. The men continued working through the attack, pulling aircraft away from burning fuel dumps, salvaging parts from damaged planes, ensuring that the mission could continue. Their names rarely appeared in newspapers or official histories, but without them, the Red Tails could not have achieved anything. The strategic bombing campaign over Europe provided the ultimate testing ground for the Tuskegee Airmen, the context in which their philosophy and skills proved most valuable. Each B-17 Flying Fortress cost approximately $238,000. Two, built on enormous sum in 1940s. Dolazan carried 10 highly trained crew members whose training had required months and significant resources. The loss of a single bomber represented not just the destruction of an expensive piece of equipment, but the potential death of 10 men and a strategic setback that rippled through the entire war effort. This is why bomber protection mattered more than racking up aerial victories. Why Colonel Davis's directive to stay with the bombers was sound strategy and not just noble philosophy. Davis understood this calculus when he ordered his pilots to resist the temptation to chase German fighters that might be fleeing or luring them away from the bombers. Anyone can shoot down a fighter if they abandon their post, he told his pilots. It takes discipline to stay with the bombers when the enemy is running, when you could get an easy kill. But our job isn't to be aces. Our job is to bring those bomber crews home. The Red Tails' escort tactics evolved through hard-won experience and careful analysis of what worked and what didn't. They developed a 3-layer defensive system that became their signature approach. Close escort fighters weaved directly above the bomber formation, positioned to immediately engage any attacker that broke through. Medium escort fighters were positioned several thousand feet higher and to the flanks, ready to intercept incoming fighters before they could reach the bombers. High escort fighters patrolled at maximum altitude, watching for diving attacks and maintaining overall situational awareness. This system required precise coordination, constant communication, and absolute discipline. A fighter pilot's instinct was to chase targets, to rack up kills. To engage in individual combat, the Red Tails had to suppress those instincts in service of the larger mission. The Tuskegee Airmen fought 2 wars simultaneously against fascism abroad and against racism at home. Their combat record challenged both Nazi racial ideology and American segregation, proving through undeniable performance that excellence in aerial combat transcended racial categorization. But the color of a pilot's skin had no bearing whatsoever on his ability to fly, fight, and lead. While the Tuskegee Airmen battled the Luftwaffe in European skies, they remained acutely aware of the battles being fought back home on their behalf and in their name. Their victories over German fighters made headlines in black newspapers, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, the Baltimore Afro-American, but were often minimized or completely ignored by the mainstream white press. When white newspapers did cover the Tuskegee Airmen, it was often in patronizing terms that emphasized the novelty of black pilots rather than their professional competence. The Pittsburgh Courier's V. Campaign Victory Against Fascism Abroad and Victory Against Racism at Home used the Tuskegee Airmen as prime examples of the contradiction at the heart of American society. How could the nation ask black Americans to risk their lives fighting for freedom and democracy in Europe while denying them those same principles at home? How could America condemn Nazi racial theories while maintaining legal segregation based on race? The Tuskegee Airmen's success made these questions unavoidable, impossible to ignore or dismiss. The contrast between German awareness and American ignorance was striking. By 1945, the Luftwaffe reportedly knew exactly who flew the red-tailed Mustangs. According to some accounts calling them Schwarze Vogelmännchen or Black Birdmen, a nickname that acknowledged their skill and presence. Meanwhile, many white Americans, even those following the war closely, didn't know black pilots existed. Newsreel footage rarely showed them. Radio broadcasts rarely mentioned them. The War Department's public relations machine, which celebrated white aces and white units extensively, rarely publicized the Tuskegee Airmen's successes. This erasure was deliberate, a reflection of a military establishment and a broader society that remained deeply uncomfortable with evidence that challenged racial hierarchies. If black pilots could succeed at the most demanding tasks in modern warfare, if they could outperform white units by some metrics, what did that say about the justifications for segregation? What did it say about the entire structure of Jim Crow? The implications were too threatening, so the easiest response was simply not to talk about it, to let the achievements happen quietly, to avoid drawing attention to evidence that undermined the racial order. Victory in Europe in May 1945 brought not celebration but uncertainty for the Tuskegee Airmen, while white units prepared for victory parades and homecoming ceremonies, while cities across America celebrated the defeat of Nazi Germany. The men of the 332nd Fighter Group faced profound questions about their future. The Army Air Forces, soon to become the independent United States Air Force, planned to maintain segregation despite overwhelming combat evidence of its absurdity and inefficiency. The experiment had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, but institutional inertia and deep-seated prejudice meant that success didn't automatically translate into policy change. For decades after World War II, the achievements of the Tuskegee Airmen remained largely unknown to mainstream America. A footnote in histories that focused on white units and white commanders. Individual pilots struggled with this erasure, with the dissonance between what they had achieved and how their country chose to remember the war. Lee Archer, who had achieved 4 confirmed victories and flown dozens of combat missions, worked as a business executive in civilian life, but rarely spoke about his war record. "Nobody believed me anyway," he said in later interviews. "If I told someone I was a fighter pilot in World War II, if I mentioned shooting down German aircraft, they'd look at me like I was lying. A black fighter pilot must be making it up, must be exaggerating." So I stopped talking about it. This pattern repeated across hundreds of Tuskegee Airmen. They had proven themselves in the most demanding circumstances imaginable, had earned the respect of the bomber crews they protected, and the grudging acknowledgement of the enemies they fought. But in post-war America, their achievements were forgotten, buried under the weight of a society that preferred not to confront uncomfortable truths about race and capability. The first significant step toward change came in 1948, when President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, mandating the integration of the United States military. Truman's decision was influenced by multiple factors: political pressure from civil rights organizations, the moral imperative of aligning American practice with American principles, the practical recognition that segregation was inefficient and wasteful. But the combat performance of the Tuskegee Airmen played a crucial role in making integration thinkable and defensible. They had proven, beyond any possibility of denial, that integrated units could function effectively, that black servicemen could perform at the highest levels. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who had led the 99th Fighter Squadron through its trial by fire in North Africa, and commanded the 332nd Fighter Group through its triumphs over Europe, became the Air Force's first black general in 1954. His promotion was both a recognition of his exceptional leadership and a symbol of how far the military had come since 1925, when an official Army War College report had declared black soldiers inherently inferior. Davis would eventually rise to the rank of lieutenant general, serving in positions of significant responsibility, proving that leadership capability had nothing to do with race. But full recognition came slowly, painfully, slowly, for men who had given their youth and risked their lives for their country. It wasn't until 2007, more than 6 decades after the end of World War II, that President George W. Bush awarded the Congressional Gold Medal collectively to the Tuskegee Airmen in a ceremony at the United States Capitol. Only about 300 of the original pilots survived to attend, elderly men in their 80s and 90s, finally receiving the national recognition they had earned so long ago. Many of their comrades, The men who had flown beside them, who had shared the danger and the triumph, had died without ever receiving acknowledgement from the nation they had served. The transformation from mockery to respect, from doubt to admiration, wasn't mythology or exaggeration, but documented historical facts supported by comprehensive records. The numbers remain irrefutable, immune to revisionism or denial. 112 aerial victories against the Luftwaffe, a total that made the 332nd one of the most successful fighter groups in the Mediterranean theater. 3 Me-262 jet fighters destroyed in a single mission on March 24, 1945, an achievement that exceeded the total Me-262 kills by most other fighter groups during the entire war. 150 enemy aircraft destroyed on the ground during strafing missions. 27 bombers lost to enemy fighters while under 332nd escort, compared to an average of 46 for other P-5. 1 groups in the 5th 10th Air Force. 96 distinguished flying crosses earned by 332nd Fighter Group pilots. To nicknames Scorching reportedly used by German pilots, whether apocryphal or authentic, represented a truth that transcended the specific words. Prejudice crumbles when confronted with undeniable capability. Every German fighter destroyed, every bomber protected, every mission completed successfully added evidence to an irrefutable case. The color of a pilot's skin, the ancestry of his parents, the neighborhood where he grew up, none of it had anything to do with his ability to fly a P-51 Mustang at 25,000 feet, to lead a formation through anti-aircraft fire, to engage enemy fighters in split-second life-or-death combat. Second Lieutenant Roscoe Brown, who shot down a German jet over Berlin and lived to see the 21st century, summarized their achievement with elegant simplicity. We didn't just fight the Germans. We fought ignorance, prejudice, and hatred, and we won all 3 battles. The Tuskegee Airmen's legacy extends far beyond their impressive combat statistics, beyond the medals and citations and confirmed victories. They changed history by proving through performance what should have been obvious. All along, that human capability is not determined by race. That excellence can emerge from any community. That prejudice is not only morally wrong, but strategically foolish, wasting talent and potential that any nation needs, especially in wartime. They fought 3 wars simultaneously and won them all, defeating the Luftwaffe in aerial combat through skill and discipline, challenging Nazi racial ideology through their very existence and success, providing living refutation of theories about racial hierarchies, and eventually helping demolish American military segregation through undeniable excellence that made continued discrimination impossible to justify. Their story is one of the great untold stories of World War II, a chapter of World War II history that deserves to be as well known as D-Day, or the Battle of the Bulge, because it reveals profound truths about courage, about justice, about the human capacity to overcome injustice and prove worth in the face of systematic denial. When given the opportunity that should have been theirs by right all along, when finally allowed to demonstrate their capabilities on equal terms, the Tuskegee Airmen soared. They transformed mockery into respect, prejudice into acceptance, doubt into admiration, and enemies, both German pilots and American skeptics, into witnesses of their extraordinary achievement. The red-tailed Mustangs that bomber crews called angels, that German pilots reportedly learned to respect, that flew 15,000 sorties over a hostile territory, represent more than just successful missions or impressive statistics. They represent the triumph of evidence over ideology, of performance over prejudice, of human capability over artificial limitations imposed by unjust social systems. They represent the best of what America could be when it lived up to its own stated principles, when it allowed all its citizens to contribute their talents to the national effort. The next time you see grainy footage of P-51 Mustangs with red tails, the next time you read about strategic bombing over Europe, remember the men who flew those aircraft, who faced death from German fighters and anti-aircraft fire, who carried the additional burden of representing an entire race, who succeeded brilliantly despite obstacles that should never have existed. Remember that their victory was not just military, but moral, not just tactical, but transformative. They helped win World War II, but more than that, they helped push America toward becoming a more just society. toward fulfilling the promise of equality that had always been part of its founding documents, but had been denied to so many for so long. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that the content of a person's character, their skill, their courage, their dedication, these are what matter. Everything else is irrelevant. It's a lesson that was learned in the skies over Europe between 1943 and 1945, written in contrails and confirmed victories, a lesson paid for in blood and sacrifice, a lesson that America is still learning today. Their story is American history, military history, human history at its most inspiring. A reminder that progress is possible, that justice can prevail, that prejudice can be defeated not just through moral arguments, but through undeniable performance that makes discrimination impossible to sustain. This has been the story of the Tuskegee Airmen, the Red Tails, the men who fought for a country that didn't fully accept them, who proved their worth in the most demanding circumstances imaginable, who changed history through excellence and courage. If you found this deep dive into World War II history meaningful, if you believe these stories deserve to be remembered and shared, make sure you're subscribed to this channel for more untold stories of World War II and comprehensive historical documentaries. Share this with anyone who loves military history, who values understanding the full complexity of the Second World War beyond the simplified narratives. And let me know in the comments what other WW2 stories you'd like us to explore. What other chapters of this vast conflict deserve this kind of detailed examination? Thank you for spending this time exploring history with me. Until next time, remember that the past has lessons for the present, and every generation has the responsibility to learn from those who came before.